Time passes. Events become memories. Memories can be forgotten. Destroying robots alongside friends? Now that is something no 25-year-old can grow out of. Chaosborn by EruDuma. Chapter 2. 20 years later. It was a wonder that Eggman didn't just give up building robots and venture into the industry of fireworks, considering so many of his metallic creations seemed to explode like the flaming things. Then again, fireworks weren't traditionally caused by the impact of a high-speed hedgehog. Not usually. Most of the robots were scrapped entirely, littering the valley in metal shards and cogs and wheels, an ugly sight in Sonic's opinion as he tore open a decapitated bee bomber and released the terrified bird inside. Nearby, Tails was nimbly dodging a few shots from a very optimistic robot, though considering it only consisted of a torso, half a head, and only one arm, the term robot could only be used half-heartedly, and it hardly concerned the young two-tailed fox, brandishing his EMP gun. Another robot went off with a bang on the other side of the gorge, where Knuckles was pummeling holes into Eggman's drones, a somewhat disturbing grin on his face. "What do you say, Knuckles?" Sonic called across the chasm. 3 badniks left. One for each of us?" The echidna kicked the head of his last victim over the edge and watched it roll for a second before looking up and visibly running his tongue over his front teeth. "Can't promise anything," he called back, brandishing his lethal knuckled fist. Tails aimed his EMP and fired, sending the remains of the robot in front of him into spasms. "Keep up, old man," he cheekily called over his shoulder, wagging his namesakes proudly. "Any more of that lip," Sonic warned, having spinballed a distracted badnik, "and you can consider your backside grounded." "Grounded?" Tails laughed, watching the blue blur. "Please, you haven't had the canines to ground me in 7 years." "Nah, 'cause here I was thinking you were a good boy." The levity was short-lived, when the robot that Knuckles had been close to destroying suddenly tried to retreat, coining onto the fact that its allies were all in bits down in the valley. On its way, however, it had chanced to gain one final victory. The ground around the edge of the gorge where Tails was stood was weak and dry and unable to withstand the deluge of missiles and laser fire that had then rained down upon it. As a result, the rocks gave way and Tails went with it, trapped underneath the debris with no room to use his tails to save himself. "Tails!" Sonic cried, leaping off the edge without a second thought, diving headlong into the mass of falling rock and using the boulders to spring from one obstacle to another. Catching sight of his best friend in amongst the rubble, the hedgehog kicked out a foot and used the valley wall as leverage to propel himself forward, snatching the fox in midair and protectively curling around him to shield him from injury. Bracing himself for a lot of pain, Sonic's body tightened, but instead of experiencing the impact from the ground, both Sonic and Tails went careening off as Knuckles leapt through and caught them, pinning them to the wall of the canyon as he dug in a fist to stop them from sliding down too far. They huddled together tightly as the rocks cascaded down, a few smaller ones striking the hedgehog and the echidna, both of whom were shielding Tails beneath them. After a few moments, the rockfall stopped. Coughing and shaking the dust from his dreadlocks, Knuckles was the first to lift a weary head, his right forearm trembling from the effort to keep them against the wall. He slowly loosened his hold so that the 3 of them started to descend gently down into the graveyard of robot remains. As soon as his feet hit solid ground, Sonic wearily blinked his eyes, worried that he could only see red. Then he worked out it was because his face was pressed into Knuckles' chest. "Everyone okay?" the echidna asked, gingerly removing his raw fist from the deep groove he had now carved into the side of the cliff. "Been better," Sonic admitted, rolling his bruised shoulders. "What about you, Tails?" The young fox had attached itself around Sonic and wasn't in any way inclined to let go. He looked up sheepishly at his 2 best friends. "I'm fine, thanks to you guys," he mumbled, big blue eyes looking downcast. "I'm really sorry, I should have—" "None of that, buddy," Sonic interrupted, standing up straight and letting Tails find his footing. "Wasn't your fault, and you would have done the same, let's face it." "What?" "You know, jump off a cliff to rescue me. I mean, well, maybe you wouldn't. I don't know." He broke off as Tails laughed, which was Sonic's full intention. "If it was anyone's fault, it's mine," Knuckles said suddenly, rubbing his hand. "That was my robot after all. But if it makes you feel better, it's gone now." "Oh, so you took care of the robot before you thought about trying to help us out?" Sonic cried in mock offence. "All happened in one fluid motion, actually. It was very elegantly done, if I do say so myself. Anyway, you're a hard-headed hog. I'm sure you would have been able to look after Tails and only walk away with a fractured rib or so. I wasn't worried. Sometimes I forget just how good of a friend you really are, Nux. We really don't deserve you, do we? Does anyone? The autumn afternoon sun was streaking through the window as Amy cuddled down on her sofa, swaddled in a blanket in front of the crackling fireplace, lost in a romantic novel while balancing a mug of tea in one hand and a bowl of popcorn on her stomach. Never had she felt so completely at ease and in total bliss. Okay, so maybe a hot bath and an evening with Sonic may have topped it, but it was good enough. Unfortunately, she'd only just lifted the mug to her lips when she heard a series of knocks at her front door. Frowning a little, Amy let out an irritated sigh and set down her bowl, mug, and book on the coffee table, throwing her blanket over the back of the sofa and getting to her feet. As she walked down the hallway, she hurriedly ruffled her quills back into place, and then opened the door, leaping back in surprise as three of her friends almost fell in on top of her. First was Tails, clinging to Sonic with one arm whilst the other supported his own back. Sonic was hunched over and had to push against the doorframe. Knuckles was just behind them, cradling his right hand and shuffling in. All three looked as though they'd had a night on the town and were now incredibly plastered, just trying to find the nearest refuge where they could throw up and collapse on a familiar carpet. They each gave a bewildered Amy a guilty smile as they went, limping and staggering down her hallway in the direction of her front room where she had just been a moment before. "Do I want to know?" she asked, pushing the door shut and mentally preparing herself for some wild story. "Knowing you," Knuckles grunted as he went by. "Probably." Rolling her eyes, the pink hedgehog female went into the kitchen and stuck the kettle on, fishing out painkillers from her medicine cabinet and pouring 3 glasses of water. In the front room, Knuckles had sunk into an armchair, and Tails and Sonic were splayed out on her sofa, the former trying to press against one square cushion, and the latter face-planting the other. "Sonic, you're bleeding!" Amy cried, dumping the water and painkiller down on the coffee table beside the popcorn and moving to look at the blue hedgehog's injured shoulder. Sonic only gave a muffled moan and said, "What happened?" Amy demanded. "Robots, laser, rock slide," answered Knuckles. "I got a sore paw and headache the size of Sonic's ego." "Pulled a muscle in my back," answered Tails. "Twisted my ankle too." "Mr. Hero over there," Knuckles then added, "took a sharp rock to the shoulder and probably his bruised lungs from when I grabbed him in midair." Amy merely sighed, far too used to the boys' adventuring mishaps to get riled up. She directed Tails and Knuckles to the water and painkillers whilst she returned to her cabinet and retrieved the first aid kit and made some coffee, returning to find 2 out of 3 friends nicely dosed. Sonic didn't seem to be especially motivated to move from his comatose position, and he only flinched a couple of times as Amy cleaned and plastered his cut shoulder. The temptation of a hot drink finally stirred him to sit up and accept the painkiller, drinking it down with his decaf coffee. No one was stupid enough to give a hyperactive Sonic the strong stuff. "Thanks, Ames," Sonic murmured, leaning back on the sofa with a sigh. Moments later, Knuckles' fist was cleaned and dressed. Tails had a heat pack on his back, and all 3 were looking ready to doze off. Smiling to herself, Amy packed away the first aid kit and briefly contemplated on whether she would be permitted to allow herself to have a teeny tiny small alcoholic drink. Deciding against it, even though she felt overdue for one, the young lady trudged along to the airing cupboard, pulling out 3 quilts and pillows. "Here," she said, throwing them at the boys. "Bunk at my place tonight and I'll let you go tomorrow if I think you're up for it." "Yes, Mother," the 3 of them chorused together. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 2. Hope you enjoyed. Hope my reading was okay. No note from Eru this time, so I'll see you on the next chapter.